The first thing I noticed wasn't the noise. It was the silence. And if you spend enough years walking the same stretch of woods, you know exactly what I mean. Silence has weight to it. I was carrying a cup of terrible gas station coffee that morning, the kind that tastes like somebody filtered it through an old work boot, and my hound dog Rusty was wandering ahead of me along the North Ridge. We'd walked that trail thousands of times over the years. Same path, same trees, same creek winding through the hollow below. Except that morning something fell off. At first I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I looked up and saw sunlight hitting the forest floor in places where sunlight had never reached before. That's when my stomach dropped. I started walking faster. 20 yards later, I found the first stump. Fresh, bright, still wet with sap. Another stood a few feet away. Then another. Then another. By the time I reached the ridge line, it looked like somebody had taken a giant razor blade and sliced a corridor straight through my property. I just stood there staring. Rusty was sniffing around piles of sawdust, while my brain tried to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. Now, for some people, trees are just trees. For me, they weren't. My name is Caleb Walker, and my family has owned that land outside Millstone Gap, Kentucky, for nearly 70 years. My grandfather bought the property after coming home from the Army. Back then, it wasn't much more than rough hills and timber. Over the decades, my family built everything piece by piece. A barn, fences, trails, memories. My dad taught me how to hunt there. My mother planted blackberry bushes along the southern fence line. My wife, Emma, and I got engaged beside a creek that runs through the middle of the property. That land wasn't something I owned. It was something I inherited, something I was supposed to protect. The worst part was seeing which trees were gone. Black walnut, white oak, the valuable ones, the healthy ones, the kind that take decades to become worth real money. Some are older than I was. One of the walnut trees had been standing there in family photographs since before I was born. Now all that remained was a stump. A few weeks earlier, a logging company had started clearing land next to mine. Everyone knew the company. Grayson Ridge Timber. Big operation, big equipment, big contracts, and a big personality running the whole thing. His name was Travis Boone. If you've ever met the kind of man who walks into every room acting like he's already won an argument nobody else knew they were having, that's Travis. The first time I met him was at a county fair years ago. He cut in front of 3 people at a food truck and somehow acted like he was doing them a favor. That was Travis. People either worked for him, owed him money, or tried not to cross him. At first, I didn't worry much about the logging operation. Property lines matter out here. Crossing them usually costs a fortune. Besides, my land had been surveyed twice. Steel markers, posted signs, clear boundaries. You'd have to ignore them on purpose. Turns out somebody had. I spent the rest of that morning documenting everything. Photos, videos, GPS coordinates, drone footage. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. Nearly 3 acres had been cut. Deep skidder tracks crossed the property line. Several survey markers were damaged. One had been flattened completely. That wasn't carelessness. That was somebody deciding my property line didn't matter. Then I found the logs, stacked neatly near the edge of the clearing, like trophies, like evidence waiting to be photographed. And sitting on top of one of those massive walnut trunks was Travis Boone himself, laughing, drinking from a water bottle, acting like it was just another workday. I remember walking toward him with my phone recording. No jidding, no threats, just anger simmering under the surface. Travis looked up, saw me coming, and for a second I got the feeling he already knew exactly why I was there. I stopped a few feet away, held up my survey map, and said 4 words. "You're on my property." The smile on his face didn't disappear. Not yet, but something behind his eyes shifted. And what happened next would turn a timber dispute into the biggest legal fight our county had seen in years. Travis looked down at the survey map for maybe half a second before shrugging. According to whose survey? I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was such a ridiculous thing to say. The county survey, I said. The same one that's been on file for years. He popped the cap back onto his water bottle and slid off the log. Around us, a few crew members suddenly became very interested in checking chainsaws that didn't need checking. Nobody wanted to be standing nearby for this conversation. Travis walked closer, hands in his pockets, completely relaxed. You know how property lines are around here, he said. They get messy. I pointed toward a crushed steel marker half buried in mud. Steel markers don't usually move themselves. His eyes followed my finger for a second. Then he looked back at me. If a few trees got mixed up, we'll smooth things over. That phrase stayed with me. Smooth things over. Like decades of growth could be fixed with a handshake and a rake. I felt my jaw tighten. You took black walnut. He shrugged. Trees grow back. And just like that, whatever chance he had of turning the situation around disappeared. Because that sentence told me everything. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't concerned. He wasn't even pretending to care. He believed he could take whatever he wanted and write a check later if someone complained. I nodded slowly. All right. That was all I said. Just 2 words. And for the first time, Travis looked slightly confused. Almost disappointed. Like he'd been expecting a shouting match. I turned around and walked away. The whole drive home, I kept replaying that conversation in my head. Trees grow back. Funny thing about arrogance. People who live with it long enough stop hearing themselves. Emma was already sitting at the kitchen table when I got home. She works as a physical therapist over in Bell County and has this annoying habit of being right about almost everything. I dropped my camera bag on the table. She looked up. How bad? I opened the laptop and showed her the drone footage. The color drained from her face. Oh, yeah. For a while, neither of us said much. The footage spoke for itself. Finally, she asked the most important question. Did you document everything before confronting them? I smiled. Married 14 years, and that's still your first question. Answer it. Yes. Good. That evening, our dining room turned into an investigation office. Maps covered the table. Photographs covered the counter. Drone footage played on repeat. I started cataloging every stump. Species, diameter, estimated age, market value, board footage. By midnight, I had spreadsheets open everywhere. By 1 in the morning, I was matching old hunting photos to missing trees. By 2 in the morning, I stopped thinking emotionally and started thinking financially. That's when things got ugly. Very ugly. Some of those walnut trees weren't ordinary timber. They were veneer grade, straight trunks, minimal defects, premium value. The kind mills compete over. The kind that don't grow overnight. I sat back in my chair, staring at the numbers. Emma walked over carrying coffee. She looked at the screen, then looked at me. Is that right? I checked it 3 times. Neither of us spoke, because the total was enough to make both of us uncomfortable. Not rich, not life-changing, but substantial. The kind of money no company accidentally loses, which led to a disturbing conclusion. Those trees weren't taken by mistake. They had been selected, cherry-picked, targeted. Whoever marked those cuts knew exactly what they were looking at. The next morning, I drove into town and met with an attorney named Harold Gaines. Harold looked exactly like the sort of lawyer you'd trust to win an argument over property rights. Gray mustache, suspenders, coffee stains, a face that permanently looked unimpressed. I handed him the evidence package. Photos, surveys, videos, valuation reports, GPS records. Harold spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing everything without saying much. Finally, he removed his glasses. You want the good news or the better news? I blinked. Usually lawyers don't phrase things that way. He smiled. Usually clients don't walk in carrying evidence this strong. I leaned forward. So, he tapped the stack of documents. If this is what it appears to be, they're in serious trouble. How serious? Harold leaned back in his chair. Potentially company-changing serious. For the first time since discovering the damage, Travis Boone looked mortal. Not in front of me. In my mind. Like maybe the giant wasn't actually as tall as everyone believed. Within 48 hours, Harold sent a formal demand package. Professional. Detailed. Cold. Every tree. Every valuation. Every violation. Everything documented. Then we waited. 3 days later, Travis Boone came to my house. I was repairing fence wire near the barn when his black pickup rolled up the driveway. The truck alone looked expensive enough to buy a small house. He climbed out wearing sunglasses and confidence. Maybe slightly less confidence than before, but plenty remained. He walked toward me while I kept working. Finally, he stopped beside the fence. You really doing this? I twisted another section of wire. Already did. You know that number's insane. You know those were my trees. He sighed dramatically. Caleb, come on. That was the first time he'd used my first name. Interesting timing. Not when he was cutting timber. Only when he needed something. It was a mistake. I laughed. A genuine laugh. Couldn't help it. He frowned. What? You ran over my survey marker. His expression hardened. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped a little closer, lowered his voice, and made the worst mistake of his entire life. You know how things work around here. I looked up. He continued. People who make problems for other people usually end up with problems themselves. There it was. Not an apology. Not accountability. A threat. Small enough to deny later. Clear enough to understand immediately. The second he said it, something changed inside me. Up until then, part of me still wanted a resolution. A settlement. A conversation. Some version of neighborly behavior. That sentence killed all of it. I suddenly understood exactly who I was dealing with. A man who had spent years pushing smaller landowners around because most people couldn't afford a fight. Most people got tired. Most people got intimidated. Most people backed down. He assumed I would too. What Travis didn't know was that Harold had already filed additional motions that very morning. And what he definitely didn't know was that a state forestry investigator had agreed to inspect the property personally. 4 days later, that investigator arrived. His name was Randall Pierce. Weathered face, mud-covered truck, 30 years of forestry experience. The sort of man who could probably identify a tree species from half a leaf blowing across a parking lot. He spent nearly 6 hours walking the property with me, measuring, photographing, documenting, hardly speaking. At one point, we reached the crushed survey marker near the ridge. Randall crouched beside it for a long time. Then he stood, looked across the clearing, and quietly said something that sent a chill straight through me. This wasn't an accident. Hearing it from him carried weight. Because he wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't guessing. He was simply stating a fact. And once those words appeared in an official report, everything changed. Insurance companies got involved. Corporate attorneys got involved. Executives started asking uncomfortable questions. For the first time, Grayson Ridge Timber wasn't controlling the narrative anymore. The evidence was. About a week later, Harold called me while I was feeding cattle. His voice sounded almost cheerful. Pack a decent shirt. I laughed. Why? They want a meeting. Travis? No. Harold paused. The lawyers. And the moment he said that, I knew something important. Travis Boone wasn't confident anymore. He was scared. A week later, Emma and I drove 2 hours south for the meeting. The law office was in Lexington, one of those modern buildings with glass walls and polished floors that somehow make a man in work boots feel underdressed no matter what he's wearing. Emma squeezed my hand before we walked inside. You behave. I always behave. She gave me a look. We both knew that wasn't entirely true. The conference room overlooked half the city. Big windows. Expensive furniture. The kind of place designed to remind everyone how much money was sitting on one side of the table. When we walked in, there were already 4 people waiting. 3 attorneys. And Travis Boone. The first thing I noticed was that he looked tired. Not physically tired. Worried tired. Like he'd spent several nights staring at a ceiling fan wondering how a simple timber harvest had become a legal disaster. Nobody smiled. Nobody shook hands. The lead attorney opened a folder. Mr. Walker, we appreciate your willingness to meet today. Harold sat beside me and quietly muttered, That's lawyer language for we're nervous. I nearly laughed. The attorney continued. Our client acknowledges there may have been confusion regarding the property boundary. Harold immediately interrupted. No confusión. The room went silent. The attorney cleared his throat. Our client is prepared to offer compensation as a gesture of good faith. There was that phrase again. Good faith. Interesting how people suddenly discover good faith after getting caught. The folder slid across the table. I opened it. The number inside was substantial. Bigger than any amount of money I'd ever personally seen attached to my name. For a moment, the room became very quiet. I could feel every eye watching me, waiting, judging, calculating. The attorney must have mistaken my silence for hesitation. We believe this offer represents a fair resolution. Fair. That word bothered me, because fairness would have been not cutting my trees in the first place. I closed the folder, then looked directly at Travis. The first time I looked at him all meeting. You ran over my survey marker. One attorney immediately jumped in. Let's avoid personalizing the issue. I didn't even glance at him. I kept looking at Travis. You knew exactly where that line was. The room stayed silent. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Travis shifted in his chair. It was a busy job site. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was pathetic. Weeks earlier, he'd been arrogant, cocky, certain. Now he sounded like a teenager explaining a dent in his father's truck. I leaned back. You know what's funny? Nobody answered. If you'd knocked on my door the first day, if you'd admitted what happened, if you'd shown even a little respect, I paused. We probably wouldn't be sitting here. And that was the truth. Most people aren't unreasonable. Mistakes happen. Life happens. But arrogance has a way of turning small problems into expensive ones. The attorney folded his hands. What exactly are you seeking, Mr. Walker? Harold answered before I could. Full statutory damages. The room immediately tightened. Everybody knew what that meant. Triple damages. The number hanging over the case wasn't just painful. It was devastating. One attorney rubbed his forehead. Another removed his glasses. And for the first time since this entire mess began, I saw genuine fear in Travis Boone's eyes. Not anger, not frustration, fear, because he had finally reached the point where money couldn't automatically solve the problem. The negotiations dragged on for another 2 weeks. Calls, emails, counteroffers, threats disguised as professional advice. At one point, one of their attorneys hinted the case could take years if we kept pushing. Harold hung up the phone and laughed. What? I asked. That's lawyer for please stop hurting us. The funny thing was I wasn't enjoying any of it. People imagine these situations feel satisfying, like some movie where the hero finally wins. Reality doesn't feel like that. Reality feels exhausting. By then I'd spent weeks reliving the damage every single day. Every phone call reminded me. Every document reminded me. Every photo reminded me. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted closure. Then, on a rainy Thursday morning, it finally happened. Harold called. They accepted. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window while rain tapped against the glass. Emma was making coffee. The house smelled like cinnamon and wet earth. Accepted what? I asked. The full amount. I blinked. All of it. Every penny. For several seconds, I didn't say anything. Neither did Emma. The rain kept falling. The coffee maker kept gurgling. Life kept moving. Eventually, she walked over and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. You okay? And honestly, I wasn't sure, because the victory didn't feel the way I expected. Money is useful. Money matters. But money isn't magic. It doesn't put a 70-year-old walnut tree back where it stood. It doesn't restore shade. It doesn't replace memories. It doesn't give time back. A few months later, I started replanting the damaged ridge. My nephew Mason helped. He was 15, all energy and questions. The kind of kid who can talk continuously for 6 straight hours without needing oxygen. We planted walnut saplings one at a time. Small trees. Fragile trees. Trees that looked impossibly tiny compared to what had been lost. The sun was setting behind the hills when Mason stopped digging. You think you'll see these fully grown? I looked across the ridge, at the new trees, at the empty spaces between them, at the scars still visible in the earth. Then I shrugged. Maybe. He waited. I smiled. Maybe not. He looked confused. Then why plant them? That question stayed with me, because it wasn't really about trees. It was about legacy, about responsibility, about leaving something behind. I pushed the shovel into the dirt, then pointed toward the saplings. Because somebody will. Mason thought about that for a while, then nodded, and we went back to work. These days, if you walk that ridge, you can still see where the old harvest happened. The younger trees move differently in the wind. The forest isn't quite the same. Maybe it never will be. But the boundary markers stand taller now. Steel reinforced. Concrete anchored. Impossible to miss. Every once in a while, somebody still brings up the Travis Boone case. Usually at a diner, a bait shop, a gas station, anywhere people gather long enough to discuss local gossip. and opinions are always split. Some folks say I did exactly what I should have done. Others think I should have taken a smaller settlement early and kept the peace. Maybe that's the real question. At what point does keeping the peace become giving permission? Because where I come from, land isn't just dirt. It isn't lines on a survey map. It's time, it's labor, it's family, it's memory. And if somebody can take those things without consequences, then ownership doesn't mean much at all. So now I want to hear what you think. If you were sitting where I sat, would you have accepted the first offer and moved on? Would you have taken Travis to court and rolled the dice with a jury? And here's the question that still divides people the most. If Travis had walked onto my property that very first day, looked me in the eye, admitted what happened, and apologized honestly, would that have changed everything? Let me know down in the comments. Because stories like this have a funny way of revealing what people believe about justice, forgiveness, and how far someone should be allowed to push before they're finally held accountable. And trust me, not everyone agrees.